Hello. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Lisa Curtis, and I'm the director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program here at the Center for a New American Security. We are here today to talk about how the United States can support human rights, especially those of women and girls in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. Our event is timely. Yesterday was International Women's Day. In previous years, for almost 2 decades, Afghan women marked this day with celebration and gratitude for the rights and opportunities they had gained. But not yesterday. Instead, Afghan women are despairing over all they have lost over the last 20 months under Taliban rule. Girls cannot attend secondary school. Young women are prohibited from attending university. Women can barely leave their homes without a male companion. They are prohibited from going to parks or gyms or holding jobs except in the healthcare sector. They are forbidden from working for humanitarian organizations, complicating U.S. aid and other international aid distribution efforts. Yesterday, the UN announced that Afghanistan is the most repressive country in the world for women, and that the Taliban has moved systematically to erase women from public life. Afghan women have bravely tried to stand up for their rights inside Afghanistan. They have held over 100 protest demonstrations throughout the nation over the last 20 months. However, the Taliban has cracked down hard on these women, beating them and detaining them, causing them to fear for their lives. Afghan women have been left to wonder why the international community has turned its back on them. Yes, international statements are being issued, like the coordinated statement of the international envoys for Afghanistan that was published yesterday. But statements are not enough. The international community must act, including taking steps to penalize the Taliban for their harsh edicts. To speak with us today about this dire situation, we are honored to have with us Ms. Rina Amiri. She is the U.S. Special Envoy for Afghan Women, Girls, and Human Rights. Ms. Amiri has over 2 decades of experience advising and working with governments in various conflict settings in Africa, the Middle East, Central and South Asia, and Europe. Ms. Amiri served as senior advisor to the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan during the Obama administration. She also served in the United Nations in various capacities, including as senior mediation expert and as a member of the United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary General's political team in Afghanistan. She has also held leadership positions in a variety of universities and think tanks, including the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard's Kennedy School, Princeton University's Innovations for Successful Societies, and New York University's Center for Global Affairs. So without further ado, let me hand the floor to Ms. Amiri.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you to CNAS for convening this important discussion today at a time of great significance. Lisa, as you noted, this was a day of celebration in Afghanistan. I remember I remember thinking that the way that Afghans celebrated it was like no other that I'd seen in other parts of the world. It was a day of really honoring women, where you would get flowers and people from throughout your community would celebrate you. And certainly in a way that we don't do it in the U.S. And so it becomes an even more tragic day when I think of the way that Afghan women must feel. And Afghan civil society. The title of this report that you are launching, Against All Odds, Supporting Civil Society and Human Rights in Taliban-Controlled Afghanistan, is apt, because what we have witnessed has removed any illusion that this Taliban is different from the Taliban of the 1990s in the way that it governs. There have been over 80 decrees, 75% of them targeted against women and girls, and all of them targeted against the rights-based population. And the situation is nothing short of devastating. I've had hundreds of conversations with women, with civil society, with ethnic and religious representatives from marginalized and targeted communities, with journalists. And there is a sense of desperation. These are people that do not want to leave Afghanistan. In fact, I would say that no Afghan wanted to leave and give up the fight for their rights, for the rights that Afghans themselves fought for more than 2 decades. We only talk about the 2 decades, but Afghans have been struggling for their rights for over a century. And to see this all taken away overnight is nothing short of devastating, and the impact is beyond what I can convey to you today. And so the question is, what are our tools? And what are our tools in a context in which we don't have presence on the ground, and a context when it's both the worst human rights situation and the worst humanitarian situation in the world, or at least I don't know if it's the data fully lines up behind this, but it's at least one of the worst in terms of humanitarian, and certainly the worst in terms of human rights. And what do you do in this context when you have a de facto government that has demonstrated that it does not prioritize the welfare of the population that they are governing? When they note, when the international community goes to them and talks about the needs of the population, whether it's the issue of women's rights, it's the sustainability of the economy, or the fact that Afghanistan is that there's a large part of the population that is on the verge of famine, and everyone is going to bed hungry. And what we have heard from the leadership has been in the press, where they say Allah will provide. They take themselves out of the equation. And so those are the challenges that we confront when we look at how and what we do to support civil society. And it should be a question of how, not whether. It should be a question, and it should not be a question of when. It should not be about sequencing, which we see in many contexts, where the argument is made, well, first security, stability, and then we'll get to the rights-based issues. These are luxury issues. These are soft issues. Give it time. And what I note is that, no, we do not have the time, because anyone who looks at the trajectory of Afghan history, anyone who looks over the 4 decades of conflict, will see that window where the population just bears and endures is not long. Conflict starts because of exactly what we're seeing in Afghanistan: exclusivity in terms of governance, depriving the Afghan population of what they aspire to and what they desire, repression, human rights violations. These are the breeding grounds of conflict. And these are the breeding grounds of extremism and instability. We've seen this all over the world. So it's taking a very narrow lens in terms of how we look at security, how we look at stabilizing Afghanistan. I think it's vastly unrealistic. So what do we do? I'm going to talk, I will tell you that we don't have all of the answers. That's why this conversation is so important. Both in my role as the special envoy for Afghan women, girls, and human rights, I struggle with this question every day. But every envoy that I speak to, every counterpart that I speak to, struggles with this issue. It's a very live question. And so this is why this report is very timely, and this conversation is absolutely critical. I'm going to tell you some of the principles that I have adopted, and some of the strategies that my office, or the efforts that my office has undertaken. One is that there's nothing that should be done without Afghan leadership. The devastating situation of
I think we have lost Rena. So we will move forward until we get Rena back in the show. There she is. We lost
I,
you, Rena, for a minute.
yeah, I am very sorry. We have a very strange system at USUN where if you don't pay attention, it turns off the camera. What I was noting is what my how I well, actually, can you tell me where I cut off so that I can start from there?
You were only off for like 2 or 3 seconds. So,
Okay.
yeah, you were just getting ready to tell us how you would frame the issue.
Okay, so in terms of the principles and some of the efforts that my office has prioritized, one is every part of our effort has to be led and guided by Afghans themselves. The last 2 decades, the entire world witnessed the leadership inside Afghanistan, the leadership at in terms and women's rights. We saw that it was the most positive environment for media freedom in the region, despite the fact that there were challenges. And we saw the enormous gains made. That population is still both in Afghanistan as well as those who were forced into exile. That expertise is there. Those are the people, those are the voices that should be guiding our efforts and should be included in every conversation. And that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen sufficiently. What my office has done to this end is set up the Afghan Civil Society platform. Now, the U.S. Afghan Civil Society platform. This is not the way that I've set it up. I must tell you, is not what Afghans had asked me to do. What many Afghan women, particularly, had asked is for me to pull together an umbrella movement in which Afghan women would establish their own movement, would have coherence, and would lead the charge of what they're doing. My assessment was that I'm the US government. If I set up something of this sort, it will be seen as a body that is being instrumentalized for political purposes. I believe that it's very important for me to support that, and there are efforts that my office is undertaking to support Afghan women to that end. But instead, what I've established in the US Afghan consultative mechanism is a mechanism that tries to meaningfully bring in the voices of Afghans into US government. What I've seen too often in the various roles that I've held prior to taking this role is that civil society and women are often brought in a check off the box way. Not always, but it happens too often where women in civil society come in, they give their recommendations, the principals across from them take notes, not politely and sympathetically. There's a photo op, and it's the end of that conversation, and it doesn't really make its way meaningfully into policy. Instead, what I am trying to do is both be really frank and honest with Afghans in terms of the policy constraints, in terms of the challenges, and also how policymaking is done inside the US government and what the political calendar is, and have an honest back and forth conversation. To that end, we've set up expert exchanges. We have four expert exchanges where US government officials at a working level are sitting across from Afghan experts and are hashing out where policy should go, and are trying to come up with concrete recommendations that hopefully we will be able to take to the secretary, to the deputy secretary, to NSC. In addition to that, we have had several meetings. Shirzad Jan was a part of at least one of them, in which they sit across principles and have very frank discussions. These are conversations in which we prepare on both sides so that it ends up being a meaningful conversation. And it has had, I think, meaningful outcomes. And one of the conversations, I think, Shirzad Jan, was the one that you had with the Deputy Secretary, Wendy Sherman. After that meeting, she was so impressed. She walked into another very high-level meeting and she took those recommendations in. So this is an effort that's going to continue. But in addition to that, we're looking to multilateralize our efforts, because Afghan women are complaining, Afghan women and civil society are complaining that they're often brought into many different forums to make the same recommendations over and over again at a time where they don't have travel money, where they're struggling with the fact that they are facing some real issues, economic issues. They don't have even the capacity for making ends meet, because they have been just very recently forced into exile, yet there's a lot of demand put on them. So what we're trying to do, we just had conversations with the EU to this end, is identify how we could multilateralize some of our efforts. And hopefully that multilateralized part of it is what would eventually move towards becoming truly Afghan-owned and led, and the EU, the US, and others could step away from that part and enable true Afghan leadership. There's the issue of engagement, this is a very fraught issue, where there's the argument that we must engage because we saw what happened in the 1990s, that walking away from Afghanistan led to more destabilization, radicalization, and the Afghan people are the ones who bore the brunt of it, particularly women and girls. And there was extremism and terrorism that emerged, and that ultimately led to the tragedy of September 11th that led to the intervention. So there's the argument that we must engage, irrespective of how egregious the Taliban are behaving. I took a different tack. I did sit down and engage the Taliban multiple times, but came to the conclusion, because I would meet with them and they would never say no. They would put forward rationalizations, just some level of justifications, and be patient. And at some point, I felt that with my file in particular, that it was not tenable for me to sit down across from them in an area where I was getting absolutely no traction. And I feared that I was legitimizing them on these issues by sitting down with them over and over again when they were not delivering in any way. So my position has been that if there is a possibility, any type of signal from them that they are prepared to move in a meaningful direction, then I will sit across from them. And a meaningful direction that goes beyond rhetoric. At the same time, I've said that I support my colleagues, like Representative Tom West, among others, to sit down and have engagements with them where they do have traction. In addition to that, we have convened, I participate very robustly in our other engagements with our like-minded allies, with our partners from various parts of the world. And particularly, I've put a lot of focus on engaging Muslim majority countries, because I've said to them that, I've traveled to Indonesia, Malaysia, Qatar, UAE, Jeddah, and other countries multiple times. And the argument that I take to them is the Taliban are doing this on the basis of Sharia. What they are doing is giving a bad name to Islam everywhere. And it's actually making your countries look bad. So your voice should be far louder than mine, because by speaking up, you will also empower the population, because the population are in this impossible position where they fight for their rights. They are framed as Western agents. And so what they have tried to do throughout Afghan history is show that they're fighting within the context of Afghan culture and Islam. But when Islam is being hijacked in the country by the Taliban, it is absolutely incumbent for Muslim majority countries to speak up and speak loudly. Yesterday, I participated in the Women in Islam conference convened by Pakistan. It was a very important conference, and the majority of the speakers spoke very strongly against the Taliban and in support of Afghan women and girls. We are also pushing them to mobilize the support into concrete actions, including scholarships, including identifying how they could provide some meaningful support to education and schools inside the country. And some, particularly Turkey, Bangladesh, among others, have made some progress. And Indonesia, in particular, they convened a conference in December on women's education, and managed to secure over 500 scholarships. It's a drop in the bucket, but we are working with Indonesia and Qatar. In fact, it was co-chaired by both of those countries. And they've made it very clear that this was the first of a series of steps that they want to undertake. I think that that's very positive. Third, what I hear over and over again from Afghan women is that we need change now. We need meaningful outcomes now. The other thing that they tell us is we are not just being hurt by the Taliban. We are also being hurt by the fact that donors have walked away from us, and by the fact that we don't have any funding. The Taliban have justification to shut down our offices because they say that we're not even bringing revenue. And they note that the best way to kill the civil society movement is to take away the funding. And so this is something that I have taken back and noted to every donor that I meet, every counterpart. I've discussed this with the World Bank. In addition, with the Secretary on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, we launched the Afghan Women Economic Resilience Alliance, which is a public-private partnership designed to bring in capacity building, support from a wide range of actors, educational tools and support to be able to provide some level of, whether it's virtual education, hybrid education, where we can. It's far from what needs to be done, because certainly with these tools, you're not going to be able to replace what Afghan women and girls are missing from being kept out of the formal education system. And finally, I'm working with Richard Bennett with UNAMA, the Human Rights Council, on accountability tools, because the fact that there has been a lack of justice throughout Afghan history, and that injustice continues is one of the I think really a fundamental part of why the conflict continues unabated, and we need accountability, even if it's going to be difficult to try to institute that now. But we need a record. We need evidence that can eventually be used. We've seen it in other conflicts to bring the Taliban and others to account. And in addition to that, I'm trying to work with these institutions to identify prevention tools and assistance tools to Afghans who are in dire need. I have not talked about relocations and resettlement, which I know is a really important issue. That mandate is not with my office, it's with CARE. I work very closely with them, particularly to bring in the cases of those that are most vulnerable. I've also not touched on humanitarian assistance, which is a very live issue, and which that debate continues in terms of how, do we cut off aid in order to take a principled position on human rights, or how do we contend with the fact that all this violates humanitarian principles? I hear different things from Afghans. Some Afghans who say cut off aid for a month, for 2 months, whatever it takes, to make the Taliban feel the pain, because the Taliban will the population will eventually hold them accountable if they are going hungry. And there are others that say no, it's the women, children, the most vulnerable people who will continue to suffer, and suffer at even greater numbers if the international community takes this approach. I will leave it at that. Again, I thank you, and I apologize that I can't be with you for the duration of the conversation. It's because it is during CSW, but again, thank you everyone for for having this discussion, and for your leadership and making sure that the issue of civil society is not dropped. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rina. That was a very clear and strong statement in support of Afghan civil society and human rights. and really appreciate you being so frank and candid about everything that your office is doing. Extremely important work that is maybe not always seen in the public eye, but it was so great to hear about it today, and we hope that it gets a lot more attention moving forward, because it's extremely important. And just because the U.S. does not have troops on the ground in Afghanistan, as you mentioned, we simply cannot turn our backs on the country. And there's still a lot of work we can do to support human rights, the women, the civil society. And it's remarkable all that your office is doing. So thank you for taking so much time and joining us today. We deeply appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Great. So now we're going to move on to the second part of the program, and Annie Pforzheimer and I are going to brief you on the findings of our recent report, Against All Odds, Supporting Human Rights and Civil Society in Taliban-Controlled Afghanistan. And our third author is not with us today, John Muhammad Jahid, but we very much appreciate his contributions to this report as well. So as we have just heard, 20 months after taking power, the Taliban is cracking down on the rights and freedoms of all Afghans, but particularly women and girls. Their harsh approach to governing the country is not only repressing millions of people, it's also fueling civil unrest, and it's laying the foundation for the reemergence of a terrorist safe haven in that country that will become a threat to global peace and security in the years to come. The crushing of democratic institutions, whether it's the parliament, the judiciary, a free press, the fact that they've disbanded things like the Independent Human Rights Agency. This shows, as Rina Amiri just talked about, that the Taliban have not changed. They're reverting to their same policies, their same backward policies that they had in the 1990s. And as we discussed, the Taliban's rollback of women's rights has been swift and comprehensive. The international community is starting to coalesce around specific principles and actions as the Taliban's approach to human rights becomes more unbending. However, the United States should be even more proactive in supporting human rights and being willing to take steps that penalize the Taliban for their egregious policies. And I think this matches up a lot with what Rina was saying, that high-level U.S. engagement with the Taliban only strengthens the Taliban's narrative that it is a legitimate power that has conquered its enemies. And that narrative further cements its control over the country. It weakens the non-Taliban civil society and civil opposition. It demoralizes the Afghan people, and it provides inspiration to other extremist groups. So some are saying that, we should engage with the Taliban for the larger cause of geopolitical stability. But I think this ignores the fact that the Afghan people are going to increasingly resist infringement of their rights and freedoms, and will begin to gravitate toward violent resistance to defy the Taliban. Another argument that we hear in favor of engaging with the Taliban is to enlist greater cooperation from them on countering terrorism. But the Taliban is already fighting Islamic State Khorasan Province, or ISKP, on their own. And I don't think we should kid ourselves into thinking that the Taliban will be a partner in countering terrorism. The Taliban has not broken ties to al-Qaeda. They are opening new madrasas that are inculcating children through new curriculum that teaches its own extremist brand of Islam. And so they're raising up a new generation of radical jihadists, which negates both the stability and counterterrorism arguments for engaging with the Taliban. And lastly, I think we need to avoid believing in this false choice of either we support human rights or we pursue counterterrorism objectives. The two issues are directly linked. The worse women and girls are treated, the greater the likelihood that Afghanistan becomes a locus of extremist ideologies and terrorism once again. So, given these realities, some of the recommendations on our report are including that the U.S. condition its engagement with the Taliban and penalize the Taliban for its human rights abuses through sanctions, even if this risks losing diplomatic access to the Taliban leadership. The U.S. should also reopen the Afghanistan embassy in Washington and allowing Afghan diplomats from the Islamic Republic to staff it. The U.S. is one of the few countries that closed its Afghan embassy. In many other countries, the Afghan missions remain open and are being staffed by Islamic Republic diplomats. Only a handful of countries like Russia, China, Pakistan, and Turkmenistan have allowed the Taliban to return to staff the embassies. Another recommendation that our report puts forward is that the U.S. should be engaging robustly with Afghan diaspora, including the political opposition. This will put pressure on the Taliban, which still craves international recognition. Um, the U.S. should facilitate the opening of an office for the political opposition in a country that is nearby Afghanistan. But this should be done on the condition that the opposition unifies themselves and focuses on bringing up a new generation of Afghan leaders. The old guard of leaders has lost credibility with many Afghans, and it's time to allow that next generation of youth leaders to take the helm. Lastly, the U.S. should formally abrogate the Doha Agreement. This is because two reasons, really. The Taliban has failed to uphold the minimal counterterrorism commitments that were made in that agreement. We know that when Al Qaeda leader Ayman al Zawahiri was located in a house associated with the Taliban's interior minister, Sirajuddin Haqqani. And also, the fact is, most Afghans view the Doha deal as giving international legitimacy to the Taliban. So I think it's finally time to just rip up that agreement, put it in the trash can. It's doing more harm than good. So with that, let me turn the floor over to my co-author, Annie Pforzheimer. Annie is a non-resident associate with the Center for Strategic and International Studies and an adjunct professor at the City University of New York. She's a retired career diplomat with the personal rank of minister counselor and over 30 years of government service. She was the acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Afghanistan until March 2019. And from 2017 to 2018, she was the Deputy Chief of Mission in Kabul. So Annie, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lisa. And thank you to everyone for coming, and really appreciation to Rena for her very hard work and a wonderful layout of what she is doing. So I'd like to share some more context for our report and its conclusions. In addition to workshops with Afghans inside the country, we took research trips which helped inform our perspective. We traveled to Brussels, Geneva, Dubai, Istanbul, and Tajikistan, meeting with UN and European Union officials, NGOs, and Afghans from the long-standing diaspora communities and those newly in exile. We heard and read a great deal. We observed that the EU and others seem to be waiting, out of habit, for a US strategic leadership which is not forthcoming. US and EU actions are politically aligned, but as Rena herself noted, they are not as fully coordinated as they could be at a program level. Regional governments are well aware of the growing terrorism dangers of Taliban leadership and the impact of ongoing human rights abuses, which may lead to even greater outflows of Afghan refugees. But for now, those governments are mainly meeting and talking without setting firm parameters on the Taliban. We are instead witnessing a kind of race to the bottom as some countries make separate business deals and diplomatic or counterterrorism arrangements with the de facto authorities. UNAMA's leadership is seen as weaker than its mandate, and there is room for expanding its role as the voice of the international community. And finally, we glimpsed a very divided Afghan community, as has been noted, along ethnic, generational, and political lines, albeit with some new energy behind a drive to unify its efforts. The report reflects a basic framing of how to approach the many, many tasks at hand. In this framing, the role and responsibility of the international community is not to set the specific terms for a new Afghanistan. It is instead to create as much space as possible for Afghans to find their way towards a sustainable, fair, and inclusive outcome. Creating space for Afghans to carry out that difficult task means the international community must stick to its principles and speak out for human rights norms and values. It must not formally recognize the Taliban or normalize what is happening, and instead should tighten sanctions and other tools of expressing international concern. Creating space also means protecting UNAMA's mandate up for renewal next week and pressing its leadership to be more active in pursuing political inclusion and conflict resolution at local, national, and international levels. As Lisa noted, creating political space would be helped on practical terms by reopening or sustaining Republic of Afghanistan embassies and other locations to allow Afghans outside the country to meet each other. And also by holding senior international meetings with the non-Taliban Afghan opposition and downgrading Taliban encounters to a technical level. And finally, political space for Afghans to push back against the harsh repression that they face requires repudiating publicly the Taliban's powerful narrative that they have a special side deal with the United States through the Doha Agreement. I will highlight a few more of our recommendations. The US government should fully coordinate its programming with like-minded countries seeking to help Afghan civil society, especially the European Union, rather than conduct separate and parallel activities. And the US should exercise all possible diplomatic tools to ensure the release of political prisoners and an end to attacks on activists, media, and women and girls exercising their fundamental human rights to free speech, education, employment, and mobility. The US Congress should push the administration to center Afghanistan policy within wider national security goals, such as pushing back on China's regional influence, promoting democracy and human rights worldwide, preventing atrocities, and fighting forced and child marriage, which is a form of trafficking in persons. The Congress should also draw a line against formal recognition or slippage into normalizing the Taliban through a mistaken alliance on counterterrorism grounds. UNAMA must use its voice and its strong mandate from the Security Council to carve out a role promoting political inclusion and preventing, not just recording, human rights violations. And the Afghan opposition, while facing trauma, displacement, and very genuine reasons for political division, must still strive to find a unifying vision of a future Afghanistan and to create a process that will engage the greatest number of citizens, both inside and outside the country. It's now my pleasure to introduce our expert panelists. They will each give a short intervention, and then the floor will be open for questions from the audience, which you can submit via the chat function on your screen or on Twitter, hashtag CNAS 2023. First, Anne Richard. Anne has had an outstanding career as a diplomat, NGO leader, and academic. She was the Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugee, and Migration Affairs and is currently a distinguished fellow with Freedom House, where she leads their program to support Afghan human rights defenders. Next, Aref Dostyar. Aref is a former official with the Afghanistan National Security Council and was Consul General of the Republic of Afghanistan in Los Angeles. He is a senior advisor at Notre Dame University's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. Finally, Shahrzad Akbar, a longtime human rights activist who led Afghanistan's Independent Human Rights Commission and now heads its successor organization, Rawadari, from London. All three have been actively finding ways to support Afghan civil society and its human rights aspirations. The work is extremely difficult, but they remain hopeful and determined. I look forward to their thoughts on the situation and our report. Anne, would you please get us started?
Yes, with pleasure. Thank you, Annie, and thank you to Lisa, and congratulations on your very clearly written and cohesive report. I want to start by doing a quick advertisement for Freedom House. Today is the day that its annual, our annual Freedom in the World report comes out. It will surprise no one on this webinar that Afghanistan is rated not free, total score of 8, in the basement with such other countries as Belarus and Somalia. So this is a very sad situation, and I'm so pleased that you folks are going deeper into the situation inside Afghanistan. I want to make half a dozen remarks very quickly on this excellent report. First is that, and we have an expert with us in terms of Shahrzad Akbar being here, so she can speak more clearly and with much more authority on what Afghan human rights defenders think than I can. But I do want to say that a lot of the human rights defenders that I'm in touch with do support sanctions against the Taliban, travel bans, terrorist designations, and as your report put so eloquently, these things should not be changed until the Taliban makes real change and doesn't just do this sort of good cop, bad cop routine that no one should come to believe. I believe you say we should show them that human rights violations come with a price. And that, I think, there's a lot of support for among Afghan human rights defenders. Secondly, the report recommends that the U.S. work closely with the UN and Europe, that there be joint plans of action. I think this is a good idea, but we also need higher levels within the U.S. bureaucracy to engage with their opposite numbers at the UN and Europe. And if that's happening, we don't see it so much. It's not part of the public discourse. And certainly Tom West and Rina Amiri, and Rina we just heard from, are working very hard trying to find ways to make constructive contributions. But there is I agree with the report that says U.S. diplomats should take into account broader geostrategic factors and should remain engaged with the situation, even if they're not close to the Taliban and not meeting with the Taliban and not giving any kind of blessing to the Taliban or phony status to the Taliban. Third, not discussed in your report, but from my background, there's a lot of concern about rescue and resettlement of people who are in jeopardy, especially human rights defenders, women and minorities, and inside Afghanistan. And we're grateful to the State Department's Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau for funding short-term emergency grants that some colleagues at Freedom House do provide to Afghan human rights defenders. But these short-term emergency grants do not help with the medium term because there are no jobs that legally folks can pursue. And people who were quite well-established and active human rights defenders are now running through their savings. It does not help with the threats they confront in neighboring countries. normal resettlement to the United States is not an emergency program. And so many allies are stuck. They've been told that they'll qualify in the future for what's called Priority 1, Priority 2, P1, P2 refugee resettlement, but it's not something that is going to rescue them in the short term. And the question I have is, can the U.S. work with the top 4 to 5 other resettlement countries to improve the numbers of vulnerable people resettled in the near future? Can we do more sooner? I'm concerned that the Congress is looking backwards. Understanding how the war was lost is a useful exercise, especially for US and other militaries, but politicians running for office, and this includes, of course, the entire House of Representatives, because they run every 2 years, who are pursuing a political blame game about who lost the war may not be productive. And we need to do everything we can to focus on the plight of innocent Afghans. And so this includes the humanitarian piece. Will donors respond this year? There was a big pledging conference last year. They raised half of what they wanted to. What happens this year? Second, special immigrant visas. There's a recent NSC cabinet appreciation expressed for groups that helped their military counterparts and interpreters and drivers some of them to come to the United States. It's a good gesture, but overall process is still too slow. And then other allies who do not qualify for special immigrant visas. And this is a very large category that includes people who did not get paychecks from the US government, but who were our allies in pursuing human rights, women's rights, and functioning democracy inside Afghanistan, such as, in addition to human rights defenders, journalists, former police and military, and ex-government officials. So congressional staff have asked me, how is the UN doing? I think there's no single UN to critique, and I like the way your report goes through and points out, differentiates between the excellent job being done by UN Special Rapporteur Richard Bennett, the tricky role of UNAMA, and I think you just said it was weaker than its mandate. And I would add UNHCR and IOM are normally groups that can help many people around the world, but they're prevented from doing what is needed in the region, and especially in Pakistan, where so many people have fled. And my final point is, minorities like the Hazara are being slaughtered. March 8th, International Women's Day, reminded us all of how Afghan women live like prisoners in their homes now. They can't even go to the park with their children, which is so bizarre. But very few seem to speak with the same level of clarity about persecuted minorities in Afghanistan, and this situation is clearly completely unacceptable. I think that I'm dealing with some, just really difficult dilemmas. One is, how do we not just protect human rights defenders, but actually enable them to do their work again? Another issue is, what do we do about all the rumors and disinformation that are rampant and seem to prey on on people who feel cut off, underappreciated, and out of the attention of world leaders right now, and that I think is a problem as well. So I've said too much, but I'll stop now and turn over to my co-panelists.
Thank you so much, Anne, for really incredible insights. And RF, would you please continue with some of your own observations? Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Annie and Lisa, for the kind invitation, and also for CNAS for organizing this event. Great to hear from Mrs. Amiri and Anne. In the outset, I would like to acknowledge the bravery of the women of Afghanistan. They are fighting to change the future for all of us, including men. And so Afghan men and men around the world must stand with women, because they are leading the way right now toward a just society in our country. And I appreciate that your report covers this issue extensively. I found the report to be comprehensive. It's rich in analysis, and it has a wide range of concrete recommendations, as you shared. And so, drawing on your recommendations, I would like to highlight maybe 3 points. First, I think everyone, probably with the exception of the Taliban, agrees that there's a problem in Afghanistan. We do not, however, have a common understanding of its source. Locals are tied with their hands in the back. Internationals are approaching it with different tools, and nobody is so far able to fix it. And so I think we must acknowledge the nature of the problem. Is it more of a technical issue or a political one? Because that will determine our approaches. I noticed in the report that you have rightly placed emphasis on the political aspect of the situation, but of course, without dismissing the other aspects. The reality is that a technical approach alone was not sufficient to address the situation in the past 18 months. And if the world's focus continues to be on just the short-term aspects, which are important, then I think they should take your proposal really seriously to adjust the level of engagement with the Taliban to a technical level only. As you and Lisa were sharing, I noted about 15 at least policy recommendations, which takes me to the second point. And my proposal is that we divide these priorities into two categories, urgent and strategic. But we have to give equal importance to both without being captive to the emergent issues. So urgent issues like includes responding to the hunger crisis, addressing the health sector collapse, and getting women out of prisons who have been imprisoned on charges of just activism, doing their job, and opening schools for girls, of course. But the challenge to address these issues is not to reverse the decrease of the Taliban, because it's not the decrease that have caused these. It's probably also not the shortage of expertise locally. The challenge is the political hostile context. And so to get out of a cycle of urgencies and the responsive approaches that result in burnout and fatigue, as we see in our UNAMA colleagues and other colleagues who are working on the ground, we need to then prioritize to address the political hotbed of the catastrophe. So what's urgent today should not remain urgent in the long term, because these are the conversations that the urgent issues that we're discussing today, we also discussed in 2021 and in 2022. And I'm afraid that it might happen in 2024, maybe next year, later this year, if we don't address the source of the issue. And this brings me to the last point. To address either category of priorities requires synergy of effort, as you pointed out, and Mrs. Amiri as well, and transparency by the international community. So the debate this month on UNAMA's upcoming mandate is an opportunity for the Security Council members to demonstrate a coordinated approach toward the country, make a commitment to implement its own mandate in Afghanistan, including its political clauses, not just the technical ones. And on this, I also welcome Ms. Zamiri's effort she said, efforts about creating an accountability mechanism, perhaps maybe even with time-bound benchmarks and sharing reports and progress of it to the public. Thank you. I will give back the floor to you.
Thank you very much. And now I would please ask Ms. Akbar to give her thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. Thanks to you and to Lisa for this report. And I'm really pleased to be part of this conversation, and very good to hear from Anne and Arif as well. Really thoughtful remarks. I think what was refreshing for your report for me was, of course, the depth of analysis, but also the fact that there are very clear recommendations in an environment where a lot of people just throw their hands up and say, there's nothing that can be done. We have tried everything. There is no possibility. That's certainly not true. There are things that can be done. I'm not in a position to comment on all of the recommendations because it's not all in my areas of expertise. But the fact that there's a wide range of recommendations is itself a great start to a conversation about what can concretely happen, what are the limitations, and kind of get out of the cycle of there's no leverage, nothing can be done, which I hear repeatedly from diplomats. The report is really good also in laying out the problems. I mean, and as also you highlighted in your recommendation, in your presentation, there is a real lack of leadership, international community's leadership on Afghanistan, right? There was everything for 20 years. The default was US leadership. And now I understand that the political in the US, or the political appetite is to forget Afghanistan, to get Afghanistan off the media. It's an embarrassing failure. It's something that didn't work out. It doesn't look good for the administration. Elections are coming up, etc. So that's the narrative. It's a narrative of failure. Afghans are corrupt. We tried our best. They're not ready for democracy, etc. There's very little nuance on it. It's very one-sided. It's very difficult for me to even sometimes listen or look at American coverage of Afghanistan because of the hurt that it causes. And of course, this has also led to a lot of mistrust. For instance, most days I would just say it's good that US is not leading anymore, because where did that bring us? So there is hurt and there is mistrust, deep hurt and mistrust. Of course, for our own political leadership as well, but also on US's role. But I think, yes, this lack of leadership, this vacuum in leadership, both regionally, because of what's happening with Russia and Ukraine and different regional countries pursuing different agendas, and globally, has really limited international leverage, has really allowed the situation where we can't do more in a country, for a country where girls can't go to school. How is this acceptable? But this can happen. And I think one key reason for it, it's of course Taliban and who they are and how they operate, but also the fact that there is lack of cohesive international response, lack of international leadership. And that's an issue that needs to be addressed. Is US the best placed actor to lead on all issues? I'm not sure. I have my questions, but I do think this question of leadership is very, very important. And it's important that the report really highlights this issue. And also the fact that how Europeans are dealing with issues around support to civil society, to human rights, and how there are lessons there to learn for the US administration and actors from the US. I think that's important. In terms of recommendations, I really believe that we need a kind of cohesion of efforts from the local, regional, and international level. And unless we have efforts at all three levels, it's really hard to see change, even in the medium term. And for the local, for the local change to happen, we really need a concentrated effort from UNAMA, from the US, and from Europeans to actually push for opening space. It is the worst fate in the world right now, might be one of the worst fates in the world, might be being someone in Afghanistan who disagrees with the Taliban. You could be held in detention indefinitely. You could be disappeared. Your family members will be held in detention. They would be tortured. We have multiple cases of protesters or people who have been arrested over a Facebook post, held in detention, tortured, or sometimes even disappeared. Taliban are very well aware of the fact that Afghanistan does not agree with them. Majority of Afghans do not agree with them. And there's the soft power of ideas that's a risk to their regime. And they're doing everything they can to go after descendants. They started initially with former security, but very quickly they expanded that focus to go after even people who are disagreeing with one of their policies on social media, because they're scared. They're scared of the female protesters. They're scared of people saying, no, this is not Islamic. This is not Afghan culture. What you're doing is wrong. They're scared of that dissent. So they're putting resources and thought and strategy into squashing that. They are not only implementing some policies to stop women from going to school or working, they are trying to transform Afghan society in their own image. I think they are thinking, 5 years from now, if we have to run for election, we will be ready to win that election, because they're opening madrasas across Afghanistan. They are labeling anything that disagrees with their idea against Islam. This is a huge, I don't want to overestimate their intelligence, but I do think that they are after transforming, purifying Afghan society as they see it. So we need to understand that vision. That's the Taliban's vision. And there's no moderate or non-moderate in that vision. And so to combat that vision, we need so much more than we have right now. And I think the first question that the US should clarify for itself is this lack of political will to be serious about Afghanistan right now. What's the opportunity cost? What's the long-term cost of this? Are they prepared for it? Is everyone prepared for it? And this is something that I think doesn't get asked enough. There is this effort to normalize Taliban and to say there are some people that Afghans agree with. They won very quickly because they have public support. So there's a whole story around this. So I think in terms of, in terms of kind of concrete recommendations, we have to first recognize Taliban for who they are. And then we have to align local, regional, and international efforts to make sure that there is support and cohesion. We have to keep pushing for space locally. Tell Taliban that they have to listen to Afghans, not to Western leaders, to Afghans and to their demands for rights, for education, for being able to criticize their own government and hold the government to account. And then the last point that I'll make would be about UNAMA, just emphasizing and kind of reinforcing your analysis. And really, I think we should expect more from UNAMA in terms of its human rights mandate. It is under-delivering. It has the mandate. It did have the mandate in the past year. It was not delivering on that mandate. There should be further transparency from them on why not so far, and reassurance from them to the Afghans on how they will deliver on this renewed mandate, once it's renewed, in protection of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shahrzad. That was really powerful. All three of you, from your different areas of expertise, have given a lot to think about. I look forward to questions now from our listeners. You can submit them in the chat function on your screen, or if you are following on Twitter through hashtag CNAS 2023. We have two questions which I'm going to combine for each of the panelists. I would appreciate you responding. So there's a question about whether there's any variation of implementation of the regressive Taliban policies. And I think that could even be talking about at the provincial level, local level, or in sectors. And then secondarily, but related, if you accept that women's organizations need funding, how could anyone get to them assuming the Taliban would intercept the funding? So is there any variation on the ground in how regressive policies are being applied? And could funding actually reach the human rights defenders who most need it? So I'll ask in the same order, Anne, and then Aref, and then Shahrzad.
There we go. On the funding, funding is reaching people in need inside Afghanistan. It's not an easy thing to do, but it is being done in a way that is bypassing the Taliban in small amounts of money. What did I want to say about this particular part? It's not enough, and I think also there's a new principle, or a renewed principle, to try to benefit local groups at the ground level, provincial level, let's say, inside countries that are getting help. And I think that is absolutely what's needed for Afghanistan. But what I've seen is that several organizations have set up a Western outpost to accept contributions, to protect their spokespeople, so that they can speak out without danger to themselves or their families, and yet at the same time move real aid inside the country. And so I would caution donors not to discriminate against these representatives of Afghan groups that are outside the country if they have very good contacts inside. To the point about the second question about variation of the implementation of regressive Taliban policies, my understanding is this is happening. I defer to both of the Afghan speakers, but my understanding is that leaders across Afghanistan are, of course, at odds with some of these Taliban policies. And so they are looking for loopholes or lighter implementation of these policies and allow girls to go to school beyond these strictures. But that puts them in in a dangerous spot, doesn't it? And so it isn't a monolithic application of what the Taliban wants. And one reason for this is the Taliban is not the majority inside Afghanistan. They happen to have seized control of the levers of power, but they don't represent large percentages of people. And so this disconnect where they have all the power, but they don't have the support of the people to the extent that a true democracy would have is something that is partly why the situation is so absurd. Thank you.
Thank you. Anne, RF, please.
Sure. I will maybe share 2 quick points on this. First is that all of these decrees and policies have created fear in the minds of everybody. So whether they are implemented or not, everyone is equally afraid of them. And therefore, I think that it doesn't really matter because, of course, it's not implemented on every single person of the population, but every single person is living their daily lives with fear. I have friends who just don't get out of their homes. One of my friends just told me last week that he had like quarantined himself for about a full week, not even going to the grocery store because he is fearful. The second point is that there are some areas of exemption on some of these policies. For instance, on issues of women's work in the health sector, there are informal exemptions, not formal exemptions. But even those informal exemptions have been made so difficult to just make it almost impossible for many of these people. For example, a woman who's a nurse is allowed to come to the hospital, but has to have a companion who's a male. And sometimes that's just not possible. Or even patients, I'm hearing in some cases. So I think that we just have to address the source. They have to go away, and they won't go away until we address the wider political context.
Thank you so much. Shahrzad, what do you think?
Thank you. On the regressive policies and their implementation, unfortunately, I have bad news. I mean, we in Rawadari have been monitoring the human rights situation in Afghanistan since 15th August 2021, and we see increasing Taliban's increasing ability for compliance and enforcement as they centralize and as they become more organized. We see that little spaces that existed in some provinces are closing up. I'll give you one example from my province. I'm from Jawzjan in North Afghanistan. My aunts are teachers. They teach grades above 6. The girls' secondary schools in Jawzjan remained open till this winter. Now they have been told that they will not be able to go back to school above grade 6. And all grade 6 students who participated in exams and who should be admitted to grade 7, they don't know what their scores are because the teachers have received instructions that they should not share scores and they should not record their graduation basically from grade 6 to go to grade 7. We were so happy and nervous but we were happy that the schools remained open. Secondary schools in Jawzjan remained open because of the community's pressure. But now that has been closed down. We see similar further compliance policing, particularly by Ministry of Virtue and Vice, on the issue of women's covering up and also having a male guardian accompanying them. Initially, this was taken very loosely, but we see that there's further enforcement. There are cases of beatings of women if they don't comply with the face cover, and if they don't comply, more cases than there were, say, a year ago. So unfortunately, we see more pressure. And in terms of going after the sins, as I said, I mean, in September, October, November 2021, we didn't see so much Taliban going after people disagreeing with them necessarily. They have organized more and more to the extent that we now understand that the intelligence department has specific resources dedicated to monitoring social media and going after people who post critical views on social media, even in some cases family members of people who are abroad. So I'm sorry that I have this bad news, but unfortunately they're getting better in enforcing their vision on Afghanistan. On the funding, as Anne said, funding can go through. You have to find creative ways, and there has to be we try different things. It's difficult, but it can go through. And it's important to remember that women activists, the group that I'm in touch with, groups that I'm in touch with, these collectives of women, they don't want huge amounts of funding, and it won't be helpful to send them huge amounts of funding. They need very little funding to pay electricity bills, to have internet, to stay connected, to print some posters and banners, and usually they try to fund this themselves, and they're all out of jobs. So keeping the civic activism alive inside Afghanistan will not require a lot of financial resources. It's more about political will and attention.
Thank you. It's so what you are saying is so discouraging. It is exactly what many observers are reporting, and as RF points out, some of it is about the active oppression, and some of it is the atmosphere of fear and self-censorship and self-repression that they've been effective in carrying out. I have a question that I will direct particularly at RF and Shahrzad, which is, how can the Afghan opposition become stronger, more cohesive, and be seen as a credible political force? So I'll let RF handle that first. I know it's a really big and tough question.
It is a tough question. It's very difficult because, unfortunately, it is a divisive time. And for good reasons also. Many of these people have lost political status, social status. It's just a time of loss, properties and jobs and country. And so it's just a time that I hope that all of these grievances are not taken out at each other, but that we can come together and create constructive proposals for the way forward. I think that there are commonalities among all of these groups, but there are also deep divisions, and I think that your report also highlighted this issue really well. I would like to propose a more decentralized and patient approach to bring these groups together. And I've been in touch with many different groups, and there is a lot of openness. They do want to come together. Perhaps if we cannot get a unified approach and stance on every single thing, that maybe we could create multiple venues and spaces again, decentralized, so that different people can come together with whoever they can feel comfortable and discuss topics and themes that they all can relate with each other, and then take it forward. We do need careful design here and a careful process to create a vision for the future among all of these groups. I think that the opportunity exists, the appetite also exists, and we are thinking about ideas and creative ways of making that happen. I do remain hopeful that that will take place.
Thank you very much. The urgency of the moment is, it's very real, but making those linkages, creating relationships, it's what you would have to draw upon, right, to have that sort of cohesive and credible political force, as the question asked. Shahrzad, do you have something that you want to say about that issue?
I really don't have much to add because I haven't thought so much about this issue. I just say that I think for credibility, one key issue is absolute humility, absolute openness about the fact that we have all failed. And the political elite have failed. I feel as a human rights activist and with someone who was also involved in trying to politically mobilize young people, I have my fair share of failures. I do think that unless we come from a place of complete humility and acceptance of the fact that we have failed in massive ways, we have failed our people, it's very hard to find any credibility. People are exhausted. No one is liked. No one. There is so much anger. There's so much hurt, rightly so. And sometimes what worries me that we have become the environment is toxic and people are so busy trying to, still establish score about who did worse, that there's not enough of that spirit of humility and kind of accountability, self-accountability. Yes.
Well, certainly, in our talks and our research, we encountered a lot of that. But also, as you are, and as others have mentioned, the point is to remain focused on the people who need help now. And if we have accounting to do it later. And actually, in that regard, Anne, I'll ask you the question that we received about the U.S. side, which is. It's written in a somewhat combative tone, but it's Washington after all. What hope is there that a joint select committee on Afghanistan in the US Congress would lead to results that are actually helpful for Afghans instead of just becoming a venue for partisan criticisms?
Yeah, I think I expressed in my remarks similar concerns that people running for office are not the best people to take cool-headed analysis of what went right, what went wrong, and what to do about it. We do have the example that many in Washington have pointed to in the past of the 9/11 Commission that wrote a report that was seen as sort of the high watermark of bipartisanship and well-written, accessible for the public, believable. The times we live in don't really lend themselves to that kind of a product normally, but perhaps the Senate, that is on a different, 6-year terms than members of the House, could pull together something or could try to come up with something where smart people are allowed to discuss these issues in a dispassionate way. It's not something that's easy to accomplish in Washington today. I listened yesterday to the House Foreign Affairs Committee discussion about what happened in August 2021 with the evacuation. And in addition to the horrible stories about the suicide bomber at the Karzai International Airport, it just was a lot of posturing too about who's at fault, and there's so much fault and blame to go around. I'm very struck by Shahrazad's comment about the negative feelings among so many people about Afghanistan. It's something I think Americans who care about Afghanistan and Afghans themselves share. It's not a good basis for building constructive responses. It is completely in keeping with the world we live in today, the post-COVID world where we've all felt so disappointed in how gains of the past are being lost. So I don't like speaking to a whole audience and being a downer like that, but I think that's a real barrier to constructive engagement on Afghan issues, is how downtrodden, if I can say that in a way that's respectful, so many of the people who've worked so hard in the past on Afghanistan feel right now.
Well, I share that exact feeling. To me, though, the urgency and the need of the moment requires us to look forward. And I'll answer that question in part by restating what I mentioned. The U.S. Congress has to think about U.S. national security concerns. And there is every reason, whatever your take is on what we did wrong in the past, that's actually not the point when you're looking towards our national security considerations. We have reason to have interests and moral obligations to help what is going on right now. But our interests include, what is China doing in the region? Or what kind of a new and burgeoning terrorist threat are we all going to face? Or aren't we a country that cares about democracy and human rights worldwide? There shouldn't be a giant exception for Afghanistan. Or don't we have a trafficking in persons policy and a prevention of atrocities policy? These are all existing legal policies, many of which are congressionally mandated, which should have Afghanistan right in the center. So rather than sort of stovepiping it as a standalone issue to talk about, remember that it's a vital part of issues that we care about right now.
Well, and this is perhaps something that I should applaud, is the way you and Lisa have produced a report that is so clearly written and takes on a very broad, in a very easily to digest way, it takes on a very broad swath of the issues related to what's going on in Afghanistan. So I applaud your efforts.
Thank you. Well, we'll take one more question from the audience, which was noting that diplomats from Afghanistan's, 6 of Afghanistan's neighbors and Russia met in Tashkent. Do you have any thoughts about what Afghan's neighbors, which may or may not consider themselves to have a human rights agenda, what could they be doing to improve the situation inside the country? And anyone who wants to answer that, please.
I can make a comment on that quickly. On all of our neighbors, they basically have 3 interests in Afghanistan, 3 major issues. One is cross-border terrorism. The other is illicit drug trafficking. And the third one is the issue of refugees. These are like the most important top 3 priorities for the region. They have to assess and see if they have made any progress in the past 18 months in any of those areas. The UN reports and every report that you look at gives you a negative answer. And therefore, my recommendation and for our neighbors, but also the international community, is for their own interest in Afghanistan to invest in inclusive alternatives and not just be too focused on one group, because Afghanistan is a big country with multiple actor groups who have their own histories and hopes for the future, and that we need to take all of those into consideration. Only then these interests will be ensured.
Thank you. Shahrzad or Anne? Go ahead.
On the issue of refugees, one of the things that a recent needs assessment of human rights defenders in and around Afghanistan discovered, this was carried out by the Afghan Canadian Civil Society Forum, was that people who cross international boundaries and get to the neighboring countries still remain highly, highly fearful for themselves because they don't feel safe, and of course for their families, especially extended family that has remained behind in Afghanistan. So, usually the refugee groups that I work with, if they cross a border, they find that they're in a position then to breathe a little bit more and get help, and it's not overly generous help, it's the basics, but at least they are safe. And what a lot of Afghan human rights folks are finding is that getting to neighboring countries does not mean that they're safe. It means that they continue to be quite frightened and fearful and feel like targets in the region.
Thank you so much. Well, we're getting to the end of our session. I'm so grateful for your time. I'm going to ask you each, all of you, the same question. And if you can come up with something quick, then first of all, you're all geniuses, but let's try. What do you think of as the sort of in your head first step that's necessary? And related to that, what's a final outcome that you hold and that you work towards? Shahrzad, may I start with you?
Thank you. I think the priority for us and our work, by speaking very narrowly and in the field that we are, is really about expansion of culture of human rights. It's about having more resources and focus and attention to expand the culture of human rights and to protect the gains that we have made that are not just the laws that were made or the institutions, but the fact that so many people became familiar with language of human rights and started demanding their rights. The demand for rights in Afghanistan expanded with the social and cultural change. How can we protect that? How can we expand that, knowing full well that Taliban is not the end of the story of Afghanistan? This is not the end of the story. This is just one moment. And are we prepared if we have an opportunity again? Have we done enough to lay the groundwork for a more equal society? And I think that kind of the end goal really is, for me, the most when it gets really hard, like 8 March is really hard. I try to think about the difference between the first time Taliban were in power and the second time now that they are in power. It's this extremely disheartening and devastating that they're back in power, but the resistance to them internally, the civic resistance to them internally, is not comparable. And that's a source of hope. How can we increase that?
Thank you so much. RF, please.
I just really like that last point. Thank you so much for bringing it up, Ms. Sackbad. I think that a lot of people are waiting for a bone type of conference, which may not happen anytime soon. If it does happen anytime, but it will certainly not happen anytime soon. Therefore, the next step is to get as many dialogue groups as possible going in a much more decentralized fashion so that conversations meaningfully start, constructive proposals are proposed, and that we can take more meaningful actions thereafter. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Anne?
We have seen that Western policies, when countries are in crisis but have bad guys leading the country, Western policies usually focus on humanitarian aid flows, which I completely endorse. However, I also think that there has to be more support flowing to human rights defenders who were our allies, who are so courageous, and who have the potential to be allies even during these, if they can get some support. And so I would like to make a pitch for that to folks who control flows of money. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. That's the end of our time. Thank you very much to our audience for participating. Some great questions. My appreciation to my co-authors, to the panelists, and to our keynote speaker. And last word has to be an appreciation of Afghan human rights defenders. Thank you so much.